For those of you who know a bit of the origin story of the Community Security Initiative, in fact, the attack that happened 7 years ago, this past October in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life, was one of the formative events that stimulated the need for the CSI to be created. Unfortunately, what happened in Tree of Life wasn't a one-off. Over the next 14 months, there were three other deadly attacks against Jewish communities in the United States, in Poway, California, in Jersey City, in New Jersey, and Muncie, New York. But Tree of Life obviously was shocking in terms of the carnage that happened there, and something that we all think about greatly, and especially from the security side of the equation. So today we're going to be joined by Stephen Weiss, a survivor from Tree of Life, as well as Brad Orsini. Brad is our national security advisor and was the security director for Pittsburgh when this event happened. I want to introduce Steve Weiss, who is a lifelong member of the Tree of Life and a survivor of the attack. Steve was born and raised in Pittsburgh and retired in 2020 after 26 years as middle school teacher. Most importantly, he's been married to his wife Jill for 38 years and has two sons, Zachary and Jonah. Steve attended Hillel Academy in Pittsburgh as well as Yeshiva University in New York City, and he has been a member and involved with Tree of Life for more than 31 years, and he even fills in for the rabbi or cantor when necessary. On October 27, 2018, Steve was in the Tree of Life building during the mass shooting. He had received the Alice training, you'll hear more about that, at both the synagogue and at the Pittsburgh Public School where he taught. And Steve will share his experience living through this event and discuss how the training that he undertook enabled him to survive the shooting. He now speaks about this experience and promotes active threat training to help everyone gain the skills to have the same chance of survival as he did. Thank you, Steve, for being here. We'll also going to have him joined by Brad Orsini. As I mentioned, Brad is now CSI's National Security Advisor, and we're so glad to have Brad on our team. Brad has a wealth of professional experience, 28 years as a special supervisory agent at FBI, 4 years U.S. Marines, where he was a captain. 3 years, as I mentioned, he was the security director at the Jewish Federation in Pittsburgh, and then 5 years working for our partner organization, the Secure Communities Network, where he was also the national security advisor. So with that, Brad and Steve, let me turn this over to you for a discussion about some of the lessons learned that our community can learn here in New York from what happened in Pittsburgh that day.
Thank you, Mitch. Back in September of 2017, I was, among other things, I was teaching in the religious school at the Tree of Life. And our principal basically set up a training for us with Brad to come in and do an Alice training. And I can remember at the time thinking that this is going to be such a waste of time. I don't know why anybody has to do this. It's just going to take away from time I could be doing something else. The principal said it's not an option. This is mandatory for all staff. I did attend the training, as well as my son, who at the time was 17, attended the training. And that was really the first I had heard about Alice, which was the type of active shooter training we had on that day. The following school year, at the end of August of 2018, the Pittsburgh Public Schools adopted Alice as their active shooter training. And as teachers, we had our first training. And I can remember thinking about how different that training was than the training that Brad had given us at the Tree of Life. Brad had video that he showed us of different incidences that were occurring around the country. He was able to give us personal information, but the training we had in the public schools really it felt like it was thrown together and not very well organized. We did have, interestingly, an Alice drill on the Friday, October 26th, the day before the shooting happened at the Tree of Life. And I can remember the kids thinking that this was such a joke. It was such an easy way to get out of class and spend a half hour not having to be there listening to teachers. On the 27th, that Saturday morning, I went to synagogue as I would. Normally on Saturday mornings, my son would go with me, and he would help me to conduct junior congregation services for our children to help them learn how services happen, what goes on, and to get them involved in some way with the services. On the last Friday of the month, we did not have junior congregation. And the shooting happened to be the last Saturday of the month. So my son was not there. Had he been there, he would have been sitting in the front lobby waiting for the kids to come in. And at 10 o'clock, we would take the kids upstairs and we would conduct our own service. So we had no children in for services that morning. Services started at 9:45, and I was there to read from the Torah, the Bible, when we would get to that part of the service. And I was sitting in the very back pew in our chapel. The service started as it always would. We had a member who would lead the introductory service, and we would reach a point where the rabbi would lead a portion of the service, a special prayer for people. Well, it's a division in different parts of the service, and it requires a quorum. We call it in Hebrew a minyan of 10 adult Jewish people. There were 12 of us in the room when that started. And as the rabbi was about halfway through with that prayer, there was a loud crashing sound out in the front hallway. And two of the people that were sitting behind me, that were ushers, went running out to see what was happening. I knew that if I left, the rabbi could not continue that prayer. So I stayed in the doorway and waited for the rabbi to finish that prayer. As he was finishing that prayer, I started to walk into the doorway, and suddenly there were a series of gunshots. And I was standing in the door looking out, and I could see shell casings from a long gun bouncing across the floor in front of me. I turned around and came back into the room, and the rabbi announced that everybody should get down in their pews so they would not be seen. Our congregation was an older congregation. I was 60 at the time, and I was probably the third youngest person in the room. We ranged from 57 up to about 95. The rabbi announced to get down. I moved over to the side of the room near the windows, and I started to get down. And I had a flashback to part of the training that Brad did for us. He showed us a shooting that took place at the Fort Lauderdale airport. And one of the things he stressed was how people were hiding in plain sight. There was somebody hiding behind an empty luggage cart that you could totally see through. And as I started to get down, that popped into my brain, and I knew it wasn't the right thing to do. So I got back up and I ran up the aisle and across the altar area and through a door that exits into the back. When I was going across that area, I started to hear gunshots in the room. As I got out of the back of that area, there was a hallway and then a set of stairs that connects to another chapel that was downstairs that one of the other congregations in our building were meeting in. We had 3 congregations that would meet on a Saturday morning in our building. I went down this back stairway so that I could let them know what was happening and make sure that they were all out of their sanctuary area so that nobody would be visible. I was down there probably for a minute and a half or 2 minutes, and I saw 3 people that were there. 2 of them were in a closet. One was their rabbi, and one was another gentleman that was standing by a closed door that would lead into the sanctuary area. When I knew that they were all safe, I started to go back up that back stairway, and then I started to hear gunshots downstairs. I continued up, and when I reached the top of the stairs, I continued down the hallway. I went out through our main sanctuary and out onto the side street. I was there for about 30 seconds when the first police car pulled up. I was able to tell the 2 officers that got out of the police car where in the building the shooter was. And they went running around to the building to contain and confront the shooter. The one officer started to open the front door, and it was glass doors. So you could see out from inside, but they were kind of mirrored. So you couldn't see from the outside in very well. As he started opening the door, the shooter inside started shooting at him, and he was wounded. And he came back around the side of the building. And when he came around, he came back to the area that I was at. And he then was taken by other officers that arrived to the area that they were starting to set up an ambulance. I was then told that I needed to move out of that area. But there were some things that, as I think back on this, that I didn't think about much or realize at the time. The training that I had, if I did not have that, I would have stayed in that room. I would have stayed down on the side of that aisle. Everybody that stayed in that room was minimally wounded, but all but one were killed. And I probably would have been among that number that were killed if I stayed in that room. If I did not have the training, and specifically the training that Brad did for us, I would have stayed in the room. I would probably have been a casualty. Now, I think back about what happened following that. Of course, we had all of the funerals. I missed a week of school because I was teaching in the public schools. And when I went back to school the next week, I met with our students and our social worker and explained to them what had happened. When we had our next Alice drill in school, the students looked at it totally different. We had explained how important the training was, how the training saved my life. And when they saw how much I stressed that, and they knew me, and here's a person that they could associate with that had gone through this situation, the Alice drill was so different. The kids took it seriously. They wanted to know what to do and how to do it properly. And once again, if I did not have that, then I would not have been able to provide that training to the students to help them. My grandfather, my wife's grandfather, excuse me, used to say that people don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. And if it weren't for the planning that I was forced to take this training, I wouldn't be here. So for that, I can't thank Brad enough. And I'm here anytime you need me, Brad. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much for sharing that day again. Everybody, it pains me every time I ask Steve to do this across the country, but I fast learned that it is cathartic for Steve to talk about it. Not only is it cathartic, he feels he wants to give back to the community. And so let me just put into context a lot of what Steve talked about today. Steve talked about ALICE, active shooter training. ALICE training is one form of active shooter training. It stands for alert, lockdown, inform, counter, and evacuate. It is the same principle as run, hide, fight, avoid, deny, defend. Whatever that protocol is, you're being taught. And we have a lot of good trainers at CSI that are going to give you those active shooter protocols. It comes down to two things and three things for Steve, especially two things for Steve and the survivors of Tree of Life. And it's that getting away from the danger and or barricading and sheltering in place. We talk about run, hide, fight, and that's how we'll focus it right now. If you can get away from that danger, get away from that danger. Steve did. But Steve took it a different level. And what I want to really talk about today is there's three ways that we do after actions of the Tree of Life. One is today. We are talking about how to save yourself. And if you could save yourself, can you render first aid, life-saving first aid to somebody else? That's first and foremost. That's what you heard from Steve. Steve was trained in active shooter. Steve lived. Steve warned other people, got other people to safety. He saved lives that day. Second way to look at this, organizationally, what do our organizations need to do? What lessons have we learned from Tree of Life that we can deploy in our schools, our schools, all our communal organizations across New York City and everywhere we touch? That's really important. In the last AAR, which I do all the time, did it last week in Atlanta, is to do an after action for law enforcement. I spent a lot of time still with law enforcement. I was just down in Atlanta last week, training law enforcement down there. We even had our groups from Community Security Service with us, the volunteer group that you all know about, that came to that training with law enforcement. They got to be included in that training and how we learned from that response in Tree of Life. We're going to focus today on some lessons learned really for how to keep yourself safe and really organizationally. So what Steve talked about, and I want to put this in context a little bit to kind of give you an idea. The Tree of Life Synagogue is probably about the worst nightmare to protect in a way that if something bad happens, law enforcement's coming in. It is a very large building, almost a block long, like many of our schools in the New York City area. They are big buildings. I want you to think about your organization right now. Not think about self, think about organization. What would that look like? Does law enforcement know what our building looks like? Do they have building layouts, plans, so on and so forth? Things you're going to learn from your training, things you're going to learn with our security directors. That being said, I just wanted to give you kind of an idea of how large this building is, and you're just going to see a picture of really what it looked like on that day and those police cars right around there. But I want to talk to you about now, how do we keep people safe? How do we mitigate loss of life? There is no secret formula to keep ourselves alive in case of danger. The model that we push out throughout all our training, our security directors, is really how do we as a community, how do we as an individual survive for 3 to 5 minutes before law enforcement gets there? So that's really what we focus on when we do those active shooter trainings like run, hide, fight, or avoid, deny, defend. We can have situational awareness, de-escalation, stop the bleed. These are training venues that every Jew in America need to attend because we really need to think about how do we keep ourselves safe. That night, on October 27th, Steve and his family came over to me, and it was probably about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night when we just started notifying families of who was killed during that day. And Steve and I had a conversation that, especially Steve's wife actually started the conversation and said, Steve's here. He went to the training and he really followed the protocol. So I had a conversation with Steve. And quite honestly, folks, this was the worst day of my professional career in 40 years of protection of the community. And I was in New York City when those two buildings fell. But walking into a synagogue, walking into a shul to see our community members just slaughtered senselessly from an AR-15, what the damage that does, not only to the devastation of the 11 souls that were lost, but what that vision does to a community is beyond reprehensible. So Steve talked about that night, about living, being trained and lived. And I told Steve, I don't know what we're going to do with this, but we're going to do something with it. And so what you see up on the screen now is survivor stories of some of the survivors from Tree of Life. Folks that we memorialized because they lived, because they had a commitment to action. Steve lived, he was trained. Audrey Glickman was in the same chapel with Steve, in the Tree of Life chapel. And keep in mind, Tree of Life took on renters, Dor Hadash and New Light. So now we have 3 different congregations who worship differently, who sometimes think differently, and now security, we need to be all on the same page. So Audrey's commitment to action was to run. She took Joe Charney, who was 90 years old, the day of Tree of Life, and they lived. They ran up, and I'll show you the rooms in a little bit here, and they lived. Rabbi Myers is the rabbi for Tree of Life. We had a training on September 5th, 7 weeks before the attack, and we had a run, hide, fight for all 3 congregations. And during that night, Rabbi Myers and I had a conversation about he's a conservative rabbi. He is not going to carry his cell phone on Shabbos. We had that age-old debate on rabbinical law and preservation of life trumps everything. And Rabbi Myers changed his protocols. He was the first one to call 911. That's really important for our community to understand that those protocols can be changed. We want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to save lives. I want to give you an idea of just what these folks went through. The top left picture is the Pervin Chapel, the Tree of Life Chapel, where they conducted services on Saturday morning. This is the smaller chapel. The large sanctuary was untouched in the Tree of Life building. This is where Steve ran up behind the altar to the left, if you're looking at the screen to the left, and ran down the stairs from there. Rabbi Myers and Audrey ran that same path, but ran up over the loft where you're looking at the altar, and he hid in a bathroom, Rabbi Myers, in the bathroom that is showed right there. He was the first one to call. The picture in the middle is where Audrey Glickman and Joe Charney barricaded in place and hid. They put donated clothing over them, shut the door, barricaded in place until they saw an option to run, right? We teach everybody when we're sheltering in place, you're not just sheltering in place and waiting for somebody to come and rescue you. You are waiting for either the police to rescue you or potentially an avenue of escape. And if there's not an avenue of escape and the actor comes in, you're going to be taught how to fight back. So fortunately for that day, people that were barricaded did not get hurt. Now, one exception is I'm going to talk about that picture on the right, which is where Steve pushed and sent people into a storage room from down below. And there were 4 people that went into that storage room. But I want to explain to you, in time of trauma, in time of this kinetic action, time seems warped. And so when you're in this very anxiety-filled situation, time is going to move so ever slowly. So an individual by the name of Melvin Wax, who is on your screen, third one in, was hard of hearing. Melvin thought there was no more danger. He got up, opened up the door, and when we found Melvin, he was right outside that door. He died. The bad guy went to the door, looked in, couldn't see anything. It was dark. The 3 others stayed in there quiet, and they lived. The point is, and this is such a learning lesson, when we do our lockdown drills, I want everybody to think about how long, if they've ever done a lockdown drill, and all our trainers, from now on, we're going to time those lockdown drills, and we're going to ask you, how long were you in that classroom locked down? And invariably, people will say minutes longer than it actually is, when it's only 30 seconds, 60 seconds. So please take that lesson. The second lesson that I want to share with you is Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz. Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz, a medical doctor, was at that training on September 5th before the shooting 7 weeks later. And we also discussed Stop the Bleed. We just put Stop the Bleed kits in all our schools, and we were talking about utilizing them. And we were talking about how we're going to deploy them, how to put a how to render self-aid for your tourniquet or a leg or something. We had a debate, as we have quite often, especially with medical professionals. They're going to want to run to the danger. Jerry Rabinowitz did exactly that. He wanted to help. And we had that conversation. Well, Brad, you're going to give us the kits. We're going to help out. But you can't help if you're dead. And Jerry did. His commitment to action was heroic. He wanted to save lives. He ran towards the danger. Him and another congregant named Dan Stein. Dan was shot and wounded, but he lived. Jerry was not going to live with his wounds. So there are so many things we've learned that day from the Tree of Life, and I want to just talk about a few of them on what's important. One of the things we do is we actually talk about lessons learned from the Tree of Life. I've had Steve numerous times go around the country to different schools, to different community events, and we do trainings, and Steve's involved. We also have documentaries that talk about the training, and it's really beneficial for you all. So if you haven't been trained, and I apologize, that was my fault. If you haven't been trained, you need to get trained. If your organization wants to do an after action, you want to talk about that active shooter protocols on how to keep yourself alive for the 3 to 5 minutes, let's get that training scheduled. Reach out to us and we'll get it. I just want to spend the few minutes left that I have kind of talking about those lessons learned organizationally and all that entails whenever we have some type of mass casualty event. I spent 28 and a half years in the FBI. My side business in the FBI was a crisis manager. And what that means is, how do we take a mass casualty event or a natural disaster or kidnapping or something that's going to necessitate a large law enforcement response, and how do we control that chaos and take that big chaos, make it medium, make it little? And so we talk about these lessons learned, and the magnitude of losing 11 community members in your community is going to be overwhelming. And there are going to be people praying after this event happens. Not only did we have the worst anti-Semitic attack in the nation's history, but after the Tree of Life, for the week that we had to prepare for the funerals, the Shivas, we were getting threats the entire time from violent extremists. So we learned so many things. There's not enough time in the day to talk about them, but just a few things. One, we know there's people out there taking advantage of a tragedy. If you have a mass casualty event, you have a riot, you have something, you're going to have these people that want to come and clean up and take your money from you and sell you things that are not going to be worth anything. It's just taking advantage of tragedies. Politicians' promises, we see that all the time. We know it's going to happen, and I don't mean this in a bad way. It just happens. Tree of Life, we had an incident on Sunday night at the large vigil where elected officials said Monday morning, when our community wakes up, there's going to be a police officer in every shul on every corner. Well, sometimes those political promises don't always get obeyed, or they're not talking to the right people. Never even talk to law enforcement about that. These things happen. If you have a death in your community, you want to identify the family wishes. We had assigned an individual from the community with the victim witness specialist to identify, what are your wishes? What do you want? Do you want that funeral open, closed, to the media, private, public? And we're going to catalog everything you need. So if there's a security issue, or if a reporter tries to get in to a Shiva or to a funeral, we're not going to let him in if that's not what you want. But we have to do these things after this incident. So there are so many things to learn. Today, we just focused on a small part of that run, that hide part. How do we keep safe? There's other areas where we could talk about how we fight back on other lessons learned in the community. But I wanted just to take a little bit of time today and really just go through why people lived. And whether it's Steve, whether it's Carol Black, whether it's Marty Gaynor, Rabbi Myers, Andrea Wedner, Barry Warber, Rabbi Perlman, these people survived because they were trained. And we need to prepare our community to be as resilient as possible. I encourage everybody to take the time, reach out to us, get the training. Steve will come if we can bring Steve in. I'll come to him. We'll do Tree of Life activities. We'll do whatever you need to make your congregation feel safe and become more resilient, like Steve and the survivors of Tree of Life. With that, thank you very much. And Mitch, I'll turn it back to you, sir.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve and Brad, for providing that very detailed understanding of what went on that day from both of your perspectives. And, I just want to reiterate what Brad said, and what obviously, we heard from Steve, is the importance of training. CSI is willing to come to your location and do this type of training. And this is important. And we'll come to your synagogue, your school, your JCC, whatever the organization is. You can do that. Go to the CSI website. You can make a request on the link, and then we will schedule a training for you and your colleagues in the congregation, whatever organization it might be. So we really want to push that out to you. So please take advantage of it. You've heard how impactful having that training was for the community, for Steve. So now let me pivot to Senior Advisor for CSI, David Pollock, who's going to talk a little bit about the situation in terms of grants. And it's a confusing one. We may have more questions than answers, but if there's anyone who can make sense of it, it's David.
Hi, thank you so much, Mitch. I just have a couple of areas that I want to cover. Yes, it's confusing, but we'll go. First of all, let's talk about the hundreds and hundreds of organizations that are currently have a grant and trying to figure out how to spend the money. What we want to remind you is, number one, there's lots of new grant requests for requests for additional documentations. So your program manager, this is especially from DCJS, a lot of changes on a state grant, and you have to always keep the state grant and the federal grant separate because they are managed by two separate agencies within the state government. This DCJS that manages the state grants is now asking for a lot of information, more than they have in the past. Here's a list. I know you can't read it easily, but it's up on our website. It's nothing new. They're sending out lists that include a lot of information that may not even apply to the items that you're purchasing. But remember, and this is up here, you can go to our webpage talking about post-grant assistance. The link is shown here. And we have lots of the information up on our website. And most importantly, if you go to CSI-NY services requests, you can, sorry, I'm not a good drawer on screen, but if you go there to this website, you can, Jamie Amatos, our Chief Administrative Officer, will set up a meeting with you and we'll do a Zoom and we will lead you through the process. We'll get you to the promised land of grant reimbursement. So that's number one. You know, we're here to help. Now, yesterday, Mitch mentioned confusion. Yesterday, the governor made another announcement. Governor Hochul announces additional $14.3 million to protect nonprofit organizations against terrorism. We're getting questions. Oh, where's this new money? How do we apply for it? This is not new money. This is merely that Governor Hochul announced that that the results for the 2024 NSS grants are out, and New York got a chunk of the money. So that's, you know, don't call us and say, how do I get to this money? This money has already been awarded. Now, what's happening in the future? It's 2025 and we expect to have grants out. Throughout the United States, there are 56 what are called state administrative agencies, the 50 states and 6 territories. All have an administrative agency that can help people get grants. The way that it's been done is split among the states, and New York and Connecticut give us a good snapshot on how it's done. In New York is saying, we don't know the rules yet, and the rules can change, and the government should tell us the rules, and then we'll get out what's called the request for applications as soon as possible. And New York has a complex system that the agencies have to go through and hoops they have to, DHSES, which runs this grant, has to get the Attorney General and the Controller and everyone to sign off on their request for applications. They're doing all that so that the minute the federal government says go, they can go. And just remember, there are two different grants in New York, Long Island, New York City, Long Island, and Westchester apply for the NSGP UA program, and the rest of New York State applies for the NSGPS. In Connecticut, they've decided we're going to put out the grant. We might have to ask for changes later, but the grant is out and their systems are ready to take the applications in, and it's due on December 12th. So anyone in Connecticut better get going and get everything in. Here's a list of what they require. Everything is done within the Connecticut Electronic Grants Management System. You have to do it there. You find the forms inside that system and you go forward. And one other change this year, I'm quoting from the Connecticut announcement, all applicants will be evaluated and sent to FEMA, and FEMA will determine which organizations will receive funding. As a matter of fact, this is slightly inaccurate because it's sent to FEMA, who then sends it to DHS, the Secretary's office, and there's a whole review process in the Secretary's office that held up the release of the NSS. And that is going to happen. During most of the Biden administration, the FEMA was content to let the states basically evaluate the applications, and basically whatever the state said went, except in very exceptional circumstances. At this point, there was we've heard of a lot of things where DHS stepped in. Finally, there's a New York State hate crimes grant. And what we do know is Governor Hochul's office indicated that the application will be released in 2026. Remember that in 2025, the legislature allocated $35 million. So what we did is we said, maybe there's a pattern here, and I'm showing the announcement from 2023, and they basically released the information at the end of January with a May deadline, giving people plenty of time. They didn't want to hear complaints that they're not giving us enough time. Estimated total program funding, they said $25 to $60 million. My guess is what the governor will do is do the same sort of range, which is $35 million is already allocated. And in the 2026 budget, they'll add some more money. So it'll probably be $60 or $70 million this year, in my opinion. And, the award ceiling, maybe 200,000, maybe something else. I don't know. And the state juggled it in various ways. But just remember that we're going to have basically two separate grants out at roughly the same time. And you have to work through that. And that's what I have to report at this point, and glad to take questions.
Great. I think, David, the one question that is in your direction, but I think you just answered, do we know when the next round of grants will be out? Which is basically, we're talking about January, probably same time.
Right. The federal grants, first of all, the shutdown has to be unshut. And then FEMA will advise the states on what their deadlines are. We thought the deadline was going to be the end of this year for the states, which meant the beginning of December for New York State, because it takes them 3 weeks to get through 700 applications. We don't know what it is. So get started now, have all the pieces in hand and ready to upload when they blow the whistle to go.
Great. Thanks, David. We do have time for a few more questions. Brad, I'm going to turn to you for this first one. And really, there are two versions of this. One saying that, like Tree of Life during the attacks on 10/7, some of the attackers claim that they were from the police. And similarly, the question is, how does one know? You talked about the time you have to spend in the shelter. What's best practice in terms of when you come out and knowing that there are friendlies out there and it's appropriate to come out of your hiding place?
Yeah, one, Mitch, that's a great question, and you're right. There's a couple different comments in there that are drilling down on that, and I'll answer three of these questions in one. One is, once we're in that barricaded situation, and what I mean by that is you're behind shelter, you're hiding, you're barricading. What you should be doing, if possible, you should be on the phone with 911. The folks that were embedded in Tree of Life were on phone with 911 until 911 got there. That is usually the best way to do that. But what I'm talking about, preparing to evacuate or fight when you're in that hiding place, it's very important to understand that if you're in a safe place and you don't have to move, you don't have to move. But we also know that if somebody's moving down the road or he's moving from room to room, trying to negotiate doors, if you have an avenue of escape, it's possible to escape. That's what Audrey Glickman and Joe Charney did that day. Rabbi Myers was on the phone with 911. Carol Black they were on the phone. They were down in. Martin Gaynor was on the phone with 911, and they were there. So a couple things. One, if you're in that position, you really want to be prepared for anything. Usually you can hear, get some on the phone, 911, ask for a badge number, have them put it under there. There's all kind of things you can do, but it's very important that when we practice this, when we practice our drills, we do this all the time. We also say, okay, come on out, we're ready. And we test for that as well. But I think it's important to have your phone, call 911, hide if you can't escape, and barricade and get prepared to fight back, if that makes sense. The second part of that was about senior citizens. What do we do with senior citizens? Well, and it's the same thing with the doctor. Somebody asked about what did we learn from the doctor running towards the danger? What we learned is that's a bad idea unless you can mitigate that threat. You could not do any good as a doctor. I've had the same conversation with high school, our yeshiva chancellor, our community day school president. We've had this. I'm going to go to the danger. No, you're not. You cannot help if you're dead. So what we learned from the death of Jerry was that he went to help. He did what he thought was right, and he died. And we wish he wouldn't have. Everybody does their action. Steve did his commitment to action. That was to run and hide other people. Jerry Rabinowitz wanted to help people, and I'm not faulting him for this. He's just not here, and I hope that all makes sense. Mitch, I think that answers a lot of the questions. The last one was the motivation. The motivation of the Tree of Life shooter. He hated Jew. He needed every Jew eradicated. He did not like Highest Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, but that wasn't the real reason. To this day, after the trial 2 years ago, he was driving back and forth to trial every day, and always told the marshals on transport every day, I wish I would have killed more. Hate-filled, pure evil. Mitch?
Great. Thank you, Brad. To the questions about when to stay in shelter and how long that might take, just this summer, we had this deadly attack at 345 Park Avenue, and NYPD had to go floor by floor as they searched for the attacker. So people in 345 Park at the upper floors, it was hours and hours before they knew that they could come out of their hiding places. So again, I think that's a good idea. If you feel secure to make a phone call, to get in touch with 911 and get another perspective. It's always better to stay in your protected area for longer than to emerge. unless, you have this opportunity to actually, escape from the location. And the last question, how often do you recommend training? We'd say, at least twice a year. Think about it like fire drills. And there's a lot more to do here. So, that should motivate many of you on the Zoom, that if you haven't had it in the last 6 months, again, Jamie put the link in there, service request. Our team would be glad to come out and do this with you. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. Just a reminder, our next training online, our next webinar will be on December 2nd, again, a Tuesday afternoon, 3 o'clock. We're still working on the topic. But Steve Weiss, I want to thank you very much for joining us and sharing your experience and your knowledge with all of us to help make us safer. And Brad, so great to have you walk us through all this. Always learn something when I hear you do this briefing. David, appreciate it as well. Have a good afternoon.